third important suggestion has to do with clubbing restrictions. Now today, anything below 10%, as Siddharth also pointed out, in a listed entity qualifies as FPI, and anything more than that as FDI. If a FPI has common ownership of 50% or more or common control, they belong to the same investor group, and the investments of all such group entities is looked at to determine the 10% cap. Now this is the existing position. What the committee is now saying that is, if any entity of such a group has an FDI or a foreign direct investment in the same stock, that will be accounted for as well. So let's say if Group X has a FDI investment of 20% in a particular stock, and further portfolio investment that comes from this group will either have to be recharacterized as FDI, or the FPI entity will need to sell down. Richie, is that how you're reading this recommendation?
Right, that is correct. So I think this actually comes from some of the earlier committees that were also formed, that could we consider participation of less than 10% economic interest as a portfolio investment, and anything more than 10% as a strategic investment. So participation by a single entity or different entities but part of the same investor group is intended perhaps to be combined together, and to assess whether the group's participation in the company now, is it below 10%, or through your other routes of participations have you sort of exceeded the 10% limit, and accordingly see where you sit on the classification, whether as a foreign portfolio investor or as an FDI on the other hand. So yes, that's a correct summary of where we are right now.
Okay, so Siddharth, let's say I invested in a particular stock, let's say in the cement space, and as an FDI investor, I picked up 20% when the stock is not listed, right? Now the stock gets listed, is on the market, and I, as the same group, through my FPI entity, wants to now invest further in this group. So is the committee saying that here you can't even begin to do that transaction, or you can't like begin to buy because you're already at 20% as a group in that particular stock? Or are they saying that you can materialize that transaction, but then you either characterize that investment as FDI, which you do on the exchange, let's say through your portfolio investment route, or you sell down?
Right. So I think first and foremost, the whole concept of this transition from FPI to FDI was something that came out of the FEMA amendments. So it was really not the work group that picked up this issue. It was an issue which came out from FEMA, but it lacked any transition mechanism. So while the intent was laid down that anything less than 10 is foreign portfolio investment, anything in excess of 10 should be FDI. Coming to your point, in a specific situation where an entity owns 20% under FDI, and now whether another group entity of that would be looking to acquire additional shares through the FPI route. Again, I don't think the committee, the principle there was that any such acquisition should be treated as FDI investment. So any additional, because the intent of the party is to be a strategic investor. So irrespective of how you acquire shares. The execution mechanism is where I think there is still a degree of grayness that would I be allowed to still go ahead and acquire as an FPI on the market? Though I will classify this as an FDI and will transfer these investments into a separate account which will be an FDI account. I think that seems to be most logical, because the status of the entity is not being taken away by virtue of this investment. So the status would still continue to be an FPI, but the investment is getting reclassified as FDI. So following the same principle, at least my personal view would be that in that scenario, there should still be a flexibility for the entity to use the FPI route to acquire shares to the extent of the permissible limit, but those shares should all then be treated as FDI in aggregate at the group level.
Oh, so then let's say, so what are the implications of when this investment gets characterized as FDI? Because anyway, it's on market sort of purchase. So let's say when you want to sell, do you then have different implication for the investment that came as FDI versus for FPI?
So actually the distinction over the years has become, especially when it comes to exit, has become lesser and lesser.
Okay.
And if you actually look at it, even FDI is free to sell its shares on the market, like an FPI. So from an exit perspective, technically you are allowed to sell these shares on the market. The issue would be if you are selling it off market. As an FPI, you are not allowed to do so. As an FDI, you are allowed to do that subject to pricing.
But this
So the
situation will
pricing-
not occur for, let's say, in an unlisted scenario, right?
That situation, because in an unlisted scenario,
FPI
anyway today at least are not permitted to invest, though it's part of
there
the
is a part of the recommendation. Yeah,
That's right.
in the to be listed
That's
sort of
correct. That's
space. Okay, so the actual sort of difference is really in this recharacterization that happens.
Correct.
But why create all these segregations if there's no material impact, as you are saying, of reclassifying my investment anyway?
I mean, the fact is, because the two parallel regimes for foreign investors exist, you need to necessarily have limits for that. If you go back to the Mayaram committee and maybe some of those committees which had deliberated whether we create a uniform foreign investment caps and then remove all of these, I guess at that point you may not need such a classification. But till then, the FPI has a different tax treatment. For example, they have a specific tax code.
So that's what I was wondering, that what would be the implications for that investment? Is tax an angle there?
Well, tax could be an angle because as an FPI, you do enjoy certain specific tax provisions which kind of mitigate or kind of define your tax status. As an FDI, you may not necessarily benefit out of it. Plus, suppose, for example, there are indirect transfer exemptions which have been made for FPI investors, which do not extend to FDI investors.
So I lose all of this the moment I recharacterize, I refuse to sell down and I recharacterize my FPI investment to FDI.
In theory, that's the implication today.
Okay.
I don't think tax has really kind of provisions have been deliberated in the context of this transition, because one argument is that the status of the investor is not changing.
Correct.
The status of the investment is changing.
Right.
So to the extent that the benefits have been extended to the status of an investor as an FPI, he should continue to be eligible for those benefits rather than taking those benefits away. So today, if the investing entity is still an FPI, there should be no reason why he should suddenly become an FDI just because one of my other group companies has acquired additional shares.
Well, if this comes in, all the best arguing that with
Well,
the tax
I think
department.
it's always going to be
a contentious
but
topic.